Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Iris Wagstaff and I'm your host for today. This interview is part of our Emerging Researchers National Conference in STEM, or EARN, webinar series. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the National Science Foundation for their support of the EARN conference over the last 10 years, particularly Claudia Rankins and Michelle Claville. I'd also like to thank the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, for their support over the last 10 years. I'd also like to thank my entire team at AAAS. It takes us all year long to plan for the EARN conference, so I really like to thank them for all of their support. We are absolutely thrilled today to have Dr. Corbett with us. She is the scientist at the National Institutes of Health, leading the team developing a vaccine for COVID-19. And in addition to learning more about her work at the NIH, we really want to learn more about Dr. Corbett, the person. She represents excellence in STEM, and we really hope this interview inspires our EARN students at this critical time. So just a note, we will be taking questions throughout the interview. So if you have questions, just post them in the question box and we will try to get through as many questions as possible. So let's get started. Welcome, Dr. Corbett. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
We know you are extremely busy, so we really appreciate you taking time out to join us. So let's get started. Tell us a little bit about your work at the NIH with your team developing the vaccine for COVID-19.
So I am the scientific lead for a team in the Vaccine Research Center. And this center is a small center, a part of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is a subsidiary of the NIH. And at the Vaccine Research Center, just overarchingly, we study vaccine development for a wider range of pathogens from HIV to Ebola to Zika. And particularly under my boss, Dr. Barney Graham, there are teams that study vaccines towards pandemic preparedness. And so I'm lucky enough to lead one of those teams, which is the coronavirus team. Our work has been ongoing their work actually since the SARS epidemic some years ago, and my work in particular for the last 6 years for starting with the MERS outbreak and then of course now with the coronavirus pandemic. And so in pandemic preparedness, our job as vaccinologists and viral immunologists and just immunologists, epidemiologists is to plan ahead of time so that we had a vaccine ready to go in case there was a pandemic like there is now. And so what you're witnessing when you hear things about our vaccine, which is being developed in collaboration with Moderna, a biotechnical company, is a response effort towards getting a vaccine into general population.
Wow, this is some really important and critical work. And on behalf of the country, I'd like to thank you for your service in science and your service to our country. So this work sounds very highly specialized. So out of all of the different areas and careers in STEM, how did you get interested in the life sciences in particular? And also tell us a little bit about your background and how you got here, how you came to be.
I became a scientist when I was 16 years old. I was lucky enough to do an internship at the University of North Carolina, which is about 15 minutes from my hometown. My parents were adamant about if we had jobs in the summer that they must be educational. And so for whatever reason, I chose to get a job in a laboratory. It was a program called Project Seed, and specifically for chemistry type fields. And so I was in an organic chemistry laboratory and I worked there for 2 years. And I fell in love with the scientific process, the dynamic day to day, essentially being the boss of your work life. You get to design your experiments, analyze the data, depending on who your real boss is, you can, come and go as you please into the laboratory. I knew that I wanted a career that looked like my principal investigator. So he was a world-renowned scientist. He actually did study in the pharmaceutical realm. So he was at the time very well known by drug companies for what he was doing. And so I knew who I wanted to be very young. I just didn't know exactly what subject. And so I spent the next, undergraduate, every summer throughout the year at school, researching in different topics, all the way from, I did, pain receptor research one year, all the way down to health disparities research, which was a more of a sociology project. And so kind of taking all of those interests together, I landed in this space where I worked at the Vaccine Research Center in undergrad during the summers, and really started to fall in love with virology and vaccine development being tied together. And it's just been all upward, I guess, from there. But I think one of the key messages in all of that is that it is very, very important to use the time that you have in your youth. I mean, honestly, even not in your youth, but to explore. And the only reason how I knew that vaccine development and using viral immunology to inform vaccine development was something that would be fun for me was because I did everything else already. And so, I kind of stumbled into this place, but I love it. So here we are.
Wow. So first of all, a shout out to Project Seed, an awesome program by one of our affiliates, the American Chemical Society. That's an awesome program. We are definitely, as a chemist, on opposite ends of the spectrum. And school, I wanted nothing to do with living things or animals or plants. So definitely agree that there are a plethora of options as far as different careers and different educational pathways in STEM. So I think at this time I'll pause to see if there are questions from the audience.
Hi, Dr. Corbett. I want to say thanks again for joining us today. At this time, we don't have any questions from the audience, but this is just serves as a reminder that we welcome your questions in the question box. Thank you.
Okay. So this next question, as a woman of color in STEM, I can already assume that you've gone through a number of challenges and barriers. Can you just share some of the challenges and barriers that you faced and how you overcame those barriers in the education and workplace?
Well, I think it just needs to be said out loud that getting a terminal PhD degree in the STEM, regardless of what your complexion is or what your ethnicity is, it is not an easy thing. It helps to have a support system while you're in graduate school, actually, throughout your entire trajectory for your career. I mean, as you can imagine right now, I'm leaning on my support system probably more than I have in my life. But, going throughout your career as a woman of color, specifically, and I'm speaking obviously from my seat, is a time. There are ups and downs. There are barriers, so to speak, but they're no different in the STEM than they are in business and whatever else. Whether it be salary negotiations or job hunting or all of these things, or frankly people assuming that you are where you are because you are a woman of color and that you might not be credible or capable. I I get that more than enough, but part of getting through those things are to surround yourself by people who really believe in you. And those people can be your family, they can be your friends, but from a professional development standpoint, find the 2 or 3 people who really see the scientist in you before they see most other things. And to say that anyone could look at a Black woman and not tell that she's a Black woman would just be naive. Honestly, I prefer people to recognize that in me, because it means that you see all of me. but also in that, see that I'm a scientist and believe that I am a scientist and I am capable of being a scientist, just as anyone else. And once you recognize who those people are, keep them in your corner. When you need criticism, call them. When you need praise, call them. And, remind them as you get to a place in your career where there's a change or there's question marks or you just need advice, always keep them updated. So I call these people my career committee. They know that they're called that. And I actually get these people together once a year by video call, even before video call was this popular, because they're all over the country. But these people, are frank enough with me to say, well, actually, or, that was great. And they also, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they don't just talk good about me to me, but they talk good about me to everyone else. And that's important as well, because
extremely. Yeah.
Right. And then I say this a lot, and I've said this in some other interviews. One of, I think, the most grounding things about in science is that science is one of those things where 90% of the things that you just do are going to fail, right? Experiments are going to fail, or you'll have to repeat them. Manuscripts will be rejected. People sometimes don't pass their PhD quals the first time, or all of these things are like, there's this huge bubble of failure around you. And so the least you could do is have someone in your corner to tell you that, like, you failed, but you did it like the right way, so to speak.
You failed successfully, yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's like my biggest advice. And then, secondly, like, remembering like who you are, is because people are going to try to tell you who you should be. And so you have to remember who you are at all times.
Wow. So you're definitely alluding to the critical need for mentoring and coaching and sponsorship. So if you're an undergraduate or graduate STEM researcher right now, what advice do you have for some of our earned students about how do you, put together your career committee, or how do you go about finding, mentors and at different stages of your career, especially as you go from undergraduate to graduate to careers?
Yeah, and so one of the good things that is important to know about this is that they will change, and not just individually. It's not like you're just gonna like call up someone and say, actually, you're not good for being a mentor for me right now. Just by the way of growth, and the way that your career will change. The mentors that I needed, the type of mentor that I needed when I was an undergrad, majoring in two things and trying to work in labs and all these, is different than the type of mentor that I need, leading a team responding to a pandemic. So in that way, it's different. The same way that you have to recognize that people are different throughout different times in your career. So I'm witnessing for the better, the relationship with my boss, for example, and I is changing throughout this pandemic, because we are becoming more and more like colleagues, as opposed to, a superior and, me. He's the deputy director. So, and so that changes. And you would just have to be able to be honest, firstly, with yourself about what you want out of a mentor. So I get a lot of emails actually in this regard. People will just send me like a blurb, a couple sentences, and they'll say, I would really love for you to mentor me. And I almost want to scream every single time, because I'm like, well, what do you want out of me?
Yeah.
And not only that, but what can you offer me?
Right.
Because it doesn't even benefit someone to be on my career committee and spend 2 hours with me every 6 months on a Zoom call with, like, Nobel laureates or else, and like not get anything out of that interaction as well.
And that's a key point, because mentoring should be a mutually beneficial relationship, right?
Absolutely.
And definitely a point to keep in mind. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, I generally ask people that because, and then if you can't answer what you can particularly offer me, and I say that, with quotes or whatever, because, for lack of a better term, but if you can't really determine what you can offer a mentor, then perhaps actually that means that they can't really offer you as much as you thought.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've had students who've done it what I like to say the right way and contacted me and say, "Oh, I've read your papers and I'm really interested in being a science writer. Like, is there anything that I could read or help you
Right.
write?" And I'm like, "What?
Right.
Sure."
Offer assistance. Right.
So that kind of thing. And picking out mentors, besides seeing someone where there's somewhat of a mirror and a balance in the relationship that you can have, is about realizing that this person has the capability of being somewhat frank.
Right.
And I think I've learned that probably a little bit too late. Actually, I think I probably didn't learn that until maybe graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's important that you pick a mentor who's honest. And then it's important also, I don't know, how they say stay in your lane. It's important that you have mentors in their specific lanes, right? So
Definitely.
that
Definitely.
you're very clear with them what you want out of them, and that they kind of, as your relationship grows over years, they understand that oh, there's an outbreak in China. I know QZ's about to be calling me every week. They understand that they're the pandemic mentor. So all of that to say that it's really a learning type of situation, and I still haven't really mastered the mentor mentee relationship as well as I probably could, but it's just something that you have to do, and probably sooner than later.
That's great advice. So one thing I wanted to mention is that this pandemic has brought to life some systemic issues in our country and throughout the world that relate to issues of equity. What advice do you have for our EARN students who may be interested in leveraging their STEM expertise to address health disparities?
Right. So I actually was a double major in undergrad in biology and sociology. And I did wet lab research, which is what they call basically going to a science lab and doing research. And then I also did research in the community, because my sociology major, most of my courses were in the sociology of healthcare and, health disparities, etc. And so I worked with a sociology professor on her project while I was in undergrad as well. And it goes to say that you don't have to really limit the types of things that you're interested in. And it also goes to say that all of these things kind of come together in one way or another. Because this is how interdisciplinary the world is becoming. And there is this kind of, particularly when you come from places where a lot of us come from, there is this somewhat an ingrained desire and necessity to feel like you're giving back. But remember that anything that you do out of passion and purpose is just by way of the grace of God is going to be given back to your community. You don't necessarily have to study health disparities or have to do really community specific things, but if it's your passion and your purpose, it'll always come right back to you, right? So I'm studying coronaviruses, which is a virus that before December, really no one in my community necessarily knew about, but as things start to come out of it, right, diabetes is one of the comorbidities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so keep that in mind. The other thing too is to remember that you should always explore. If beyond, when I tell my niece to explore, she goes to Google, but kind of beyond the Google exploration. Find out who are people who are doing the very niche kind of stuff that you're doing. For example, I got this weird, not necessarily weird, but you know, this obsession with like research behind like fetal development and like stillbirths, and I like started to do research about like who's doing it. It's like 2 people in this country who actually do that kind of research. But like
Wow.
once you find those people, contact those people and ask them how they melded all of it together. And you'll find that it really was, you know, gelling little pieces of interest together for the good and to really specialize in one thing.
That's awesome. So this definitely leads into the next question, which you touched on a little bit. So many students in our audience are majoring in STEM with the intent to specifically serve their communities. So what do you say to these students, especially in light of the fact that if they speak too loudly or too passionately on behalf of their communities, that they might receive backlash?
You know, I would say that like my parents have always said to me, and still to this day say to me, you know, your voice sometimes is the only thing that you have. Like every single thing else people can take away. And so, you know, just as long as you learn a way of being tactful, and understand also that your work speaks for you too, right? So without saying too much, people are going to know what type of impact you make just by making sure that your work is good, and that you stand out in the way that you address the issues that you are interested in addressing. One of the ways that, like, for example, quote unquote, like I use my voice, but still am in my seat as what like scientific lead of blah blah blah. So I'm a Christian. I like grew up real churchy, and so I you know I'll speak at churches, and so I still get to like do my science, but also give back to a community that I feel like I'm indebted to. I oftentimes have I spend a lot of time, not a lot of time, but you know, I generally say yes to presentations at HBCUs without much question because that's another way. And you know, it's giving back to my community, but it is also highlighting my science, which is essentially for the world, you know, not just for my community. So you know you'll find a way to use your voice because at some point people are going to want to listen to you because your work is going to be that good,
Speak for itself.
and it just is for you.
That's great advice. So at this point, I think I will pause to see if there are any questions from the audience.
We do have a ton of questions from our audience. To kind of play into the question Iris just asked, one of our audience members asked about vaccines, and they noted that there is somewhat of a stigma surrounding vaccines, and they want to know, how do you support the narrative that vaccines are essential, particularly in this time, and if your approach is different when you're connecting with communities of color, and if so, they would like to know how.
Okay, so my approach to most things are the same regardless of who I'm connecting to. I like to remain transparent. I like to remain true to who I am. And I like to speak with some level of conviction because at some point, the only way that people are going to listen to you is if you are essentially prove to them that you've listened to yourself, right? So the data that we generate or that vaccinologists generate, when it's robust and through the standard of clinical trial development, et cetera, when I speak about it proudly and with some level of belief. And, you know, I am very well aware. Part of being in Project Seed meant that I had to like Project Seed was directed by a military guy who was very much into discipline, and he did not play about history. We read all about, you know, the Tuskegee experiments, did presentations. And so the historical concept, the historical context around fear in our community and other communities is something that is real and should not be taken lightly. And so I understand that. I think that I have to be aware that I sit in a place of privilege because I'm surrounded by an understanding of what the nitty-gritty of data looks like. The understanding behind what goes into a clinical trial. I actually, now that I'm actually really experiencing seeing something through clinical trial, I want to scream to people that listen, the FDA is not anyone's friend, including mine. So if it's getting through the FDA, it's good. But I understand, right? And then vaccines aren't like therapeutics, right? So if someone has a chronic illness and a physician says, you need to take this so that you live, there really isn't any question. But if someone is healthy and a physician says, you need to take this so that you might live if you do happen to get sick, on the off chance that you are in the 40% of people that do get sick, but then even still only 2% of them die, it's a lot, right? It's just a lot to process.
Right.
But I like to tell people that vaccinology, particularly getting vaccines as a healthy middle-aged person, is not about you. It's one of those times where you have to step outside of yourself, and even if you understand what it means to be vaccinated so that you protect people around you who can't be vaccinated, I think that's just even more important. So it's going to be, for example, for this virus, it's going to be critical to get a critical mass of people vaccinated so that the elderly are protected, because the elderly are extremely vulnerable to and dying at higher rates than the middle-aged population. So, it's a work in progress. I understand where the fears come from. I also, loud and proudly say that I support people's choices despite whether they choose to be vaccinated or not, because I think that healthcare should be a choice just like any other American choice. But I think that we have to really start to pinpoint where those fears come from, and then hold the people who are responsible for answering to those fears accountable. So me and my team, not necessarily, okay?
Okay.
But where the fears come from, and then addressing them directly to those people. So, for example, if you fear that vaccines cause autism, then you need to find a way to dig into that piece of the story and hold the people who try to prove that responsible for that piece of information. But not every single vaccine, right?
Right.
And I think that's just one of those things we have to translate.
Great. So we'll take another question.
Sure. A ton of people have recognized that your life has probably changed a little bit in the last 6 months, in that you are extremely busy. Not that you weren't before, but more so now. And they want to know, what is your work balance like? How do you cope with this time? Things like that.
So, most people would say that I've probably always been somewhat of a workaholic. So I will say that my life has changed, right? Because now it's less out of, oh, I'm gonna get out of bed because I know there's data in my computer from somebody on the team, as opposed to I'm gonna get out of bed because, this data needs to be put into some format so it can be sent to the FDA. I cope by praying a lot, firstly, and then, therapy as well. So I have a therapist who I've had since I've moved here, and that's been extremely helpful throughout this time. And then just finding a little bit of me time. So, I watched Michelle Obama's Becoming like 4 times the other day. I was just like, okay, this is worth putting a little delay on the vaccine response. And then it's hard to be surrounded, so to speak, with people that you love right now in this social isolation period. But I do, I call my nieces and nephews every day still. I get on group chats with my friends still. And just finding a little bit of time outside of the work. I think I haven't necessarily felt much change, honestly, behind the workload is obviously a lot more, and I sleep less, but I don't feel like I'm not taking care of myself, or I don't feel stressed in that way.
We'll take a few more questions.
All right. Well, I'm glad that you are not feeling particularly stressed.
In
And
that
again,
way.
in that way, yes.
That way.
Um, so moving along, someone asked, what are some key strategies you've used to stay the course? And if you've ever second guessed being a Black female scientist?
Every single,
Wow.
not every day, but I mean, like even as late as I think, the beginning of this pandemic response, I'm just like, wait, it's like a pandemic. There is absolutely no way that I can do this.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it comes from other people too, right? So having people who believe in you, I say that again and again and again, and also you just have to kind of take a drink of like some ego tea and say, what if I wasn't here?
Right.
And I'm not, everybody, I probably won't even get to respond to another pandemic in my lifetime because it is a once in a lifetime kind of thing. But if you're in graduate school, ask yourself what like whatever project you're working on, however big or however small, what if you were not there?
Right.
Who would do it? And then if the person that you can think of, and you're like, no, you're in the right place, okay? And I think that it's easy to get a little bit of imposter syndrome, particularly around just this career trajectory is long, right? So it's you get to the point, and you'll start to see your friends begin to, especially when you're in graduate school, like making more money than you, and like, why am I doing this? Yeah. You have to remember that who you want to be requires the thing, and the thing is generally the degree. And then remember who you are, and that there's a reason why you were chosen to be in this place. And I think sometimes I'll do things like read like a piece of literature like completely outside of my scope. And I will it'll remind me like, oh, I'm exactly like where I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. Because other people are reading what I'm writing, or other people in like this field are writing, and they can't understand that either. And so once you realize like who you are and the seat that you sit in, just sit there and be content in it. That's the other thing too that sometimes people have in general, especially high achieving people, have a problem with doing is just being content in your seat. A lot of times, if you really step back about the doubts that you have around your career or what's going on in your professional life, some of those doubts often come from you just not being content with like where you are.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That's awesome advice. Definitely being content in your own space, and celebrate the small achievements also along the way. I think that's really important. So on to some delving questions about Dr. Corbett, the person. Tell us a little bit about like what are your hobbies and what are you most looking forward to doing once we get on the other side of this pandemic?
I like to travel, even if it's just weekend trips. So last year, you know, taking together all the little small trips that I took like 17 trips, whether it's going back home, you know, traveling just up to New York to see a show or two, etc. So the first thing I'm going to do is hop on a plane and use every drop of my vacation time. You know, my hobbies include, so I'm home and I'm staring at my wine fridge right now, so I collect wine. And I like to consider myself like somewhat of a good wine taster, I guess.
Connoisseur.
And you know, I like to do different things like hiking. I actually really like hiking. Some outdoorsy stuff like hiking, like I would do like a day like fishing, but it's not like the thing that I want to do. And I spend a lot of times with my friends. So people like really like, it seems like you like date your friends, but like no, like me and my friends actually do a lot of things together. And so, and science actually. So science outside of the day-to-day lab things and the writing papers and the analyzing data, but the fun parts of science, I still love, right? So science museum, I will go to a random exhibit. So yeah, those are my kinds of hobbies.
So many of us over the last 6 weeks have a newfound love for Netflix since we've been cooped in. So tell us, what's your favorite show on Netflix right now?
So I have only watched Netflix as much as like a couple times throughout this pandemic, I must say. And even before that, I'm not really into TV. But so I watched Michelle Obama's Becoming about 4 times. I really like the show Black AF. I love it actually. So I watched that entire show. It's not a Netflix show, but I've gotten into this show called For Life. I'm not sure if you know about it. It's about like the guy who was in prison and he got his law degree and started to like change lives. And then How to Get Away with Murder still.
Yes. One more show.
Oh, and This Is Us. This Is Us. I love This Is Us.
Okay. So if I took a peek at your iTunes, your Apple Music, or your Spotify playlist, what would I find?
A little Jeezy. So I was like everything from like trap music to, you know, soul, gospel. I've recently been listening to a lot of DaBaby. I generally start my morning with Jeezy just because it's like tradition. Because like in high school, Thug Motivation 101 was like a thing. I love Beyonce, but like I think everybody does. I listen to a lot of like UK soul, so like Palio Nutini and stuff like that. Tony Braxton still. I feel so old saying this. They're probably like kids on this webinar. But yeah, so, yeah, like Tony Braxton. Yeah.
So I know you're probably, in interview fatigue right now. You've been doing lots of interviews all around the country and globally. What's something that nobody's ever asked you, or something that nobody would ever guess about you?
You know, I actually very much like, why do people even care about my life? Like to me, it's just like so boring and normal. But one of the things that people haven't asked about me, I mean, it's been alluded to a little bit, is that I come from a really like a mixed family. So a family of stepchildren, foster children, and adopted children. So my parents I have, 7 siblings, or the 7 of us. And we are, quote unquote gang, but it's a very mixed family. So that's one interesting thing that people don't know about me.
Oh, wow.
Another interesting thing that people don't know about me is that as a child, I collected Barbies. So I was like really into it. Yeah, I mean,
Did you have all the gear, the car and the truck and all of
I had like every like Barbie thing. Actually, my mom still has like a ton of the collector's items that I had back in the day.
Wow.
So she keeps saying that I need to come get them, but we'll see.
That's going to be a valuable collection, I predict. So,
Yeah.
so I'll pause now to see if we have any other questions from the audience.
So we do have some questions about Dr. Corbett. For one, so you said that you have known you wanted to be a scientist since you were 16. If you couldn't be a scientist, what would you be?
That's a good
Sleep, girl. Taking naps. I always get this, and I never know how to answer it. I used I if I actually one of the reasons why my job has this like hold on me is because if I couldn't be a scientist, I have no idea. I literally have no idea what I would be. I don't know of anything else that would be as intellectually stimulating. Anything else that would have this level of day-to-day freedom that I have. And you know, I could think of a few things that make tons more money, right? But as far as like passion, yeah, science. I maybe would change fields. Um, you know, I find myself like dabbling in like neuroscience literature a little bit. So I maybe like would have explored neuroscience a little bit more, but I would be a scientist.
Cool. Well, I'm glad that you were so steadfast in your profession. That's amazing. And then I have one other question, and then, I guess it's two. So, what is your favorite genre of books, and do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, so I read a lot of like biographies. That sounds so boring. Um, so yeah, I mean, I read all the biographies that you could think of, like Michelle Obama's, Malcolm X's, etc. I read a lot of poetry. So particularly for whatever reason, like Persian poets. Actually, Beyonce's daughter is named after a Persian poet, Rumi. So I've read like all of the Rumi collections. I recently, so I have a book Pinterest. So you guys can follow me on Pinterest, and I have books on my Pinterest. I'm looking at some of them. So a recent poem book that I've read is like the Black Girl Magic one. I got a really good book that actually, for the purposes of this conversation, would be a good one to check out. It's called The Memo. I'm looking at it actually. It's called The Memo. It's about basically how to solidify your seat at the table. And it is extremely well written, and all of the things you think you know about solidifying your seat, it will probably just rip those things to shreds and show you the way. So everybody should get that. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions from the audience?
Let me see. We have a lot of praise.
Oh, thanks, guys.
I don't see any questions coming in at this moment.
So I will ask our next to the last, or probably our last question. What would you say to encourage our undergraduate and our graduate STEM majors to really persevere in STEM and to stay on task with their educational and career goals, especially, you know, at this critical time in our country where a lot of things are up in the air, maybe plans for graduate school or career opportunities. So what would you say to our earned students to really encourage them to just really stay on task and persevere in this STEM field, in this STEM area?
You know, I think for me, it was finding a couple of people who would not let me not persevere, right? So I think, and a couple of people who I knew would be very blunt and honest about what it meant if I stopped in that moment. And because a lot of times you can't necessarily see the light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, I'm you know, with all of the praise, so to speak, even right now, I'm like, what? I mean, you mean to tell me that like we probably won't vaccinate the general population for like next spring and like and maybe there might be another wave of it in fall and you know, all of these things. And so just finding people that can bring you back to your place. And then just reiterating what I said earlier about being content is probably the biggest and most important lesson that one can learn in a field in the STEM fields, because again, failure is almost imminent on a day-to-day basis. And so you have to be able to just sit there and say, okay, I'm good with it like that. You know what? My project manager just sent me back a manuscript this morning. And she was like, I can tell that at the end you were struggling with the mechanism and not really being able to pin it down. But I want to let you know that sometimes good is good enough.
Mhm.
And that's
Yeah.
just it. And I'm like, okay, girl, we're going to submit
Yeah.
this thing by the end of the week. So
That's great about it.
just find your place where you are just like, okay.
That's even great advice for me, and I'm out of school, so I guess I'll just close with this. What would you tell your 21-year-old self, Dr. Corbett, given that when you're going through a undergraduate school, graduate school, especially in a STEM major, you don't know what you don't know. So what would you tell your 21-year-old self?
Books for boys.
I love it.
No, for real. Actually, I'm joking. I'm joking. Kind of. No, I think that one of the some of the things that I wish I would have learned earlier were how to save money. So you think just because, especially when you're 21 and then when you're in graduate school, when you're not making really any money, that you can't save, but there's always a way to live below your means, and get into a habit of saving. And so I know it's not really sciencey, but that was one of the things that I feel like had I learned it earlier, I could be like right now, like, oh, I can just retire after the pandemic.
Oh,
Not kidding.
that's
And then
awesome advice. Yeah.
yeah, and then I think another lesson that I wish I would have learned earlier, and I just started to come into it most recently, but is the exploration piece, not just around fields, but around places. So I look back and I'm like, have I really spent my entire life between North Carolina and Maryland? And it just worked out, right? So I've been in great programs in, undergraduate, then I went back to UNC, then I came back here to the NIH. But I've lived in these two places. And so it's like, as much as you can, explore your options very widely, geographically. I think it's important to put your worldview on sooner than later. I guess those are the kind of the, oh, and then, for people who are really interested in science, and, how they think about science, principal investigator kind of science, it's important earlier than later to hone your presentation skills and your writing skills. So verbal communication right now is one of the things that I'm like, well, I am so happy that I paid attention to those things. And written communication too, right? So just as much as you can, practice those things as early as possible.
Well, thank you. That, honing your presentation skills and presenting scientific data is really the crux of what the EARN conference is. So I'm really glad that our students got a chance to speak with you. I know you have enough urgent matters to attend to, so we're gonna end a little bit early, but I definitely want to thank you for joining us today.
If you have another question they can ask, I can
Sure.
get on. I can leave in like 5 minutes. It's okay.
Did we have any other?
This is actually a breath of fresh air.
Yes, we would love to talk to you for another hour. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
We definitely have some more questions. First off, people want to know how to follow you on Pinterest.
That's funny. Just my name, I think. I don't know. I don't even know if they're like, I don't know. Just my name, just Kismikia Corbett. You should be able to search me and I should be there.
Okay, and then someone asked, when is the book coming out? They want more of you. So
you know, if there is a book, I'll make sure that everybody is aware of it sooner than later.
Someone asked an interesting question. So obviously you have become somewhat famous. For example, like on Twitter. Do you ever have any haters or people that come out on these forums, like these public forums, and how do you respond?
I mean, I don't know if you necessarily can call them haters, but some people are never going to be satisfied, right? And so that's why you just have to satisfy yourself. I think that criticism is something that, as hard as it is to take sometimes, it is something that we should all kind of heed to, no matter from whom it comes. And of course, everyone doesn't have your best interest at heart, but you know, they go low, we go high. However, Michelle said it. I think, you know, this is not, you know, in the midst of like this bubble of criticism or whatever, my parents were like, girl, when they were calling your scholarships out in high school, people were booing. People are going to hate what they can't compete with, period.
Yeah.
And so just let your work speak for itself and, you know, keep it moving. That's all you can do.
Okay, we'll take one final question from the audience.
All right, I'm trying to find a really good one to close off here.
The pressure.
I know, the pressure. Well, we ran out of the ones that are specifically about you and the maybe less work ones, but this is interesting. Some key strategies for navigating microaggressions or biases that you've experienced.
Oh my, y'all need to have a conference with my therapist because I'm still learning. She is not pleased with me, by the way. I am not good at this because I grew up in a place where passive aggressive and microaggression just were not a thing. When you got aggressive, you got aggressive. Right. And so I'm still learning how to be not as, you know, someone says something in a microaggressive way to me, I generally just say, listen, what do you mean by that? You know, can you please just tell me what your thoughts are? I tend to be transparent with other people, so I expect the same, but that's not necessarily how the world works. You become more and more, I guess, deaf to it as time passes, because the truth of the matter is all of them are the same. People are just saying the same thing in different ways. So once you've heard it once, you've heard it twice and 3 times. You know, just again, as much as you can, just like allow your work to speak for you. Remember, especially in the professional environment, remember that there is always an HR department that has your back, or should, at least if you feel like things are out of hand with microaggressions, because they can get out of hand, trust me. Contact your HR department and allow them to do their job in that way.
So I think we will end on that note. I'd like to thank Dr. Corbett. We really appreciate you taking time out to join us today. I know you have a very important next meeting to get to, but I just wanted to close. I want to thank all of the viewers for joining us. For more information about AAAS, go to aaas.org. For more information about our EARN conference, go to emerging-researchers.org. And finally, before we close, I'd like to mention that our EARN conference is being featured in the STEM for All video showcase. So we would really love your support. The title of our video entry is Next Gen STEM, Diverse Researchers Addressing Global Challenges. So if you go to the STEM for All video showcase, we would love for you to view our video, post discussion comments, and definitely vote for our EARN video entry. The showcase ends tomorrow. So thank you all for joining us and have a great day. Thank you, Dr. Corbett.
Bye. Thank you.